My name is Bernard Keogh. I'm Widnes born and bred. I was born in Grenfell Street in 1945, which is the street where my great-grandfather lived. My father was born there, and many of my uncles and siblings. I went to St Mary's School, then on to Fisher and Moore, and left in 1960. In 1961, I was fortunate enough to gain employment at Bowman's Chemicals in Mossbank in Widnes. My job at the time was as the junior office boy, which is a job I thoroughly enjoyed. I became quite involved in administration and doing all of the chores that office boys had to do at the time. And it gave me a great insight into business because I became quite involved. At the age of 17 and a half, I was told by my boss that I couldn't be an office boy all my life, which came as a bit of a surprise at the time. So they gave me two options. One option was to go to college on an apprenticeship to become an apprentice fitter. And the other option was to go onto the plants as a chemical plant operator. I was very reluctant to go back to school, as I thought, so I plumped for the easy option, which was to go and work on the plants. And I found it to be a very interesting job, and my salary at the time, or my wage, went from £4, 10 shillings a week to £8 a week. So not only did I make a good move, but I became quite well off at the time as well. So I was reluctant to go to school, and during the course of my working on the pilot plant, as it was a research plant. So because it was research, it was more interesting because I got to go into the laboratories, I got to work with chemists, and I got to work with some of the old hands on the plants. And it was at that time I was approached by the research director to go to college, which is the thing I didn't want to do, really. So I said, no, I don't think I'll bother, really. But the old head that I worked with said, no, let's go, because you get a day off with pay. So I said, to go along with him, I said, okay, I'll come to college with you and we'll do this chemical plant operators course, which was a City and Guilds. So we started in the September, and by the Christmas, Joe, my mate, had packed in because he couldn't take it, and I carried on. And 4 years later, I got a distinction in chemical plant operation. But by this time, I was really involved in the processes and the research and all of the ins and outs of working a chemical plant, albeit on a small scale, but it was doing interesting work. That was really the start of my career in the chemical industry, because from there I went to do ONC in chemistry, I then did HNC in chemistry. I was then told if I wanted to get on in the world, I had to get a qualification. So I then went to St Helens Technical College. So 13 years after I started my education, I finished with a diploma in industrial management. That then took me into the management side of running chemical plants, basically. And because it was a research plant, it developed products. We made some very interesting products. I worked on things like making cysteine, which is an amino acid from chicken feathers. We made oxalic acid from sawdust. And we made lots of very obscure and interesting chemicals, basically down to the managing director, he was called the Sockless Wonder. He was the managing director of Bowman's for many years and was quite a character. It was due to him that we actually developed many of these exotic products, and that became the basis of my continuing interest in the chemical industry. From that stage, I progressed working under several old-fashioned managers in the chemical industry. But as a young chap, I became known as a good manager, in effect, because I had different ideas, I had a fresh outlook on chemical operations, and because I'd done my training, of course, I was able to make a success of the jobs that I undertook. So I went from being a plant operator to being a senior operator on the plant. I then became an assistant plant manager over a number of small plants, one of which was a sulfonated oils plant, which was the basis of the industry that Bowman started in. And then I took over as the lactic acid plant manager, which was the biggest plant on site. Bowman's Chemicals was a pioneer in many areas, not only in the development of new chemicals, but also in the lactic acid industry, where they were in the 1940s and 50s a world leader in the manufacture. In the middle 1950s, they developed a purification process to manufacture not only a crude product, which was used in the leather tanning trade, but also a food-grade product, which then became usable in foodstuffs as an acidulant. The most famous use of lactic acid, to me, was its use in the Fox's glacier mints, because without it, the Fox's glacier mint would not be clear. And those of you who remember the advert with the bear standing on top of the mint that you couldn't see was due to the use of lactic acid in the Fox's glacier mint. So again, lots of interest. The next product that was developed there on a major scale was malic acid, which is the acid of apples. So all acids contain malic acid, and that's the natural food acid for apples. So it became used in soft drinks industries and in the manufacture, would you believe, of cider, because it was a natural acidulant to use in the manufacture of cider. So Bowman's pioneered and developed that process into a worldwide manufacturing scale.
And it was always Bowman's, it wasn't then taken over, or how did that?
Well, in terms of the change from Bowman's, because it was a unique industry that they were in because of the products that we made, it was in 1968 it was purchased by Keogh. Keogh Chemicals was a small but growing British chemical manufacturer based in Hull. And Keogh fought to take over Bowman's Chemicals from the big boys in the chemical industry at the time, one of which was Bowman. And Keogh was successful in purchasing the company. So that was 1968. And from that time onwards, Bowman's became one of the main manufacturing centres for the Keogh Chemicals empire, which was growing year on year. And interestingly, that chemical company now is the largest British-owned chemical company in Great Britain, simply because it's developed into quite niche and unique markets in its own products. So in terms of my own career in the chemical industry, I went really from strength to strength, and I eventually became a manager of the large chemical plants on site. And in 1990, the company started to go into decline. The products, because they were old products, were losing favour in the chemical industry, and other manufacturers abroad were making it cheaper. And Bowman's began to struggle then, or Keogh Bowman's as it was then, began to struggle. So there was, I not only went through a large increase in staffing from the 1960s, where there were about 150 people, it went up to in the region of about 280 people as a head office for one of the major groups in Keogh. And from the 1980s and into the 90s, declined into employing 70 people. Then eventually I took over the running of the factory as the works manager in 1991. And we underwent a resurgence by rationalising the production on site. We invested money into the fabric of the site because the factory itself and the equipment was in quite poor condition through lack of investment. And we went through a mini resurgence which lasted for 15 years until my retirement in 2005.